Content warning. War, eugenics, racism, mass destruction, crackpot science, and those pesky Nazis. Action, excitement, horror, romance, thrills and chills, swords and sorcery, rockets and ray guns, a dizzying panoply of the strange and impossible from the darkest depths of the human imagination. What mad universe encompasses such tales as these? Join us as we bear witness to the sweeping sprawl of all the history that never was and all the futures that could yet be. It's adventure as you like it on What Mad Universe?
It was a dark and stormy night. Wait, sorry, wrong book. Give me a second. Therewith, Z began to enter into an explanation of which I understood very little, for there is no word in any language I know which is an exact synonym for Vril. I should call it electricity, except that it comprehends in its manifold branches other forms of nature, to which our scientific nomenclature differing names are assigned, such as magnetism, galvanism, etc. This is from The Coming Race, 1871, by Edward George Bulwer-Lytton. Hi, welcome to What Mad Universe, a podcast where we talk about pulp novels from the classic to the obscure. I'm Philip, and with me, as always, is Adam.
Hello.
And today we're once again joined by a special guest, Jess Nevins. Hello, Jess.
Hello.
Today we're discussing a book from an author who these days suffers from a very negative reputation. He's most famous now for starting his 1830 novel, Paul Clifford, with the following sentence. It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals, when it was checked by a violent gust of wind which swept up the streets, for it was London that our scene lies, rattling through the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps which struggled against the darkness. Catchy. There's a writing prize named after him that invites authors to come up with the worst opening lines possible for a novel. It's been going since 1982. But we come not to bury Bulwer-Lytton, but to praise him, I guess. In his day, he coined phrases such as the great unwashed, pursuit of the almighty dollar, the pen is mightier than the sword, and dweller on the threshold. Jess, without going into too much about this specific book we're talking about today, I believe you have some thoughts on Mr. Bulwer-Lytton's talents in general?
Yeah, he was, to borrow the term from baseball, he was a five-tool player. He either created genres or helped popularize them. He was, one of his mysteries was signally influential on Edgar Allan Poe when Poe wrote his mysteries, which founded the genre. A Coming Race helped establish science fiction as a viable genre. He was influential in creating the domestic realism genre in historical novels. He had a talent unmatched in the 19th century in putting a book out when it was the most timely. He was popular. He was critically esteemed. His style evolved over time so that in the 1830s, he was writing crime novels. In the 1820s, he was writing high society novels that were witty and sort of not Jane Austen-like, but in the same rough area. Then he established the occult fantasy genre and wrote his most long-winded works. And then in the 1860s, 1870s, his style evolves into something that's a lot less dated. And so you've got The Coming Race. So he gets a bad rap, but the things he gets criticized the most for are common in writers of the 1830s, so that you get the same really overextended opening sentences in Charles Dickens, for example. So I feel I don't have any personal connection to Bulwer-Lytton, but I feel like always need to defend his good name.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that is interesting. This is the first Bulwer-Lytton I've read, but yeah, I mean, it's. I would hardly say, oh yeah, this guy's so much worse than any of his contemporaneous writers.
It's a little overwritten. There's a little it's very purple prose, but it's not terrible by any means.
Yeah, I mean the main thing with this. Well, let's
talk about the
story.
I still have more of the preamble here. Yeah. The novel we're here to discuss is a science fiction story called alternatively Vril, the Coming Race, or Vril, the Power of the Coming Race. It deals with the discovery of an underground civilization of humans who have harnessed an energy source called Vril, capable of great destruction and creation, healing, mind control, and pretty much anything you can name. The society is so greatly prizes this energy that they name themselves after it, and the Vril look down upon those who have yet to discover it and harness it as barbarians.
Yeah, so it's basically a guy who's working in a mining concern, ends up falling deep into the earth, or rather a guy who had one of the workers who had gone deep into the earth comes back with stories of, I saw light coming from underneath the ground. So he goes with the guy on an expedition, and they end up descending. They do fall, right? Like, yeah. They accidentally fall down,
and then the other guy dies.
And the other guy dies, but the narrator, who's never given a name, discovers this that there's this entire civilization living down there called the Vril. Was this the first, Jess, example of a underground civilization, Hollow Earth? It can't have been the first, right?
No, it wasn't.
No, there were Hollow Earth novels go back to the start of novel writing. It was well established by the time he wrote. There was an important one called The Journey of Niels Kim to the World Underground in 1741, and then there was there were novels written in the 1820s because of a American soldier who popularized the idea of the Hollow Earth. 1838, you had Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym.
Right.
And then you had Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. And so it's actually rather the Coming Race is actually rather late in the history of the genre for as far as Hollow Earth novels go.
Okay. Sorry, you said something about an American soldier in 1820. What was that about?
John Cleve Sims was this American soldier who became obsessed with the idea that the Earth was hollow and that there was an entrance in the North Pole. And so he wrote articles about it. He wrote stories about it. He went on lecture tours. There was at least one failed expedition, and the theory of the Hollow Earth became known as the Sims theory. It took off because of everything he did and the way he popularized it.
I see. Was he inspired by something specific, or did he just he just woke up one day and said the Earth must be hollow?
No, it was a idée fixe. It was just this obsession he had that he was going to prove the world right. And it's the 1810s, 1820s. There's not they haven't mapped the world yet. They haven't come up with the idea of tectonic plates. There's a lot still unknown about the Earth, and so while the idea of the Hollow Earth is ridiculous to us now, back then it was no more ridiculous than a lot of what people were talking about as far as the substance of the Earth.
It should be noted there's two kinds of Hollow Earth in these kinds of stories or theories. The first kind that you were talking about is literally the Earth is just a hollow shell. The crust exists on the outside, and generally on the inside there's the core is a central sun.
Right.
So this is what appears in, say, the Pellucidar stories by Edgar Rice Burroughs, which is much later, or the Queen of Atvatabar by, who was that by again?
I don't remember offhand. I know which
Yeah,
novel you're
sorry,
talking about.
I should have written that down. And the second kind is the idea that the crust or the mantle or something has massive caverns in it. So that's like the Journey to the Center of the Earth and this one.
Right.
So this is a large country-sized cavern in the crust of the Earth.
Right. So with the core is the central sun, so they think gravity reverses itself, and you're walking around.
So people walk on the inner surface, and that's the ground. So the ground in the distance seemed to slope upwards.
That's kind of. What's an example of that, Phil? That you're
Well,
aware
like I said, Pellucidar is the most probably the
okay.
the most still relevant example
Right.
that people still read, basically.
Right. And it's usually also, correct me if I'm wrong, it's usually also associated with, ancient peoples and ancient
Dinosaurs
forms of
are a
life.
frequent thing.
Yeah, exactly. And in this one as well, these guys are sort of said to have. What was the explanation given in this again? It was they were driven under by the
They're
flood.
antediluvian, so they're
Right.
before Noah's flood, basically.
Right.
It seems to take that as something that actually happened.
Right.
And it also has, it sort of has dinosaurs. There's giant crocodile alligator
Right.
things called Kreka.
Yeah.
So I guess.
Yeah, no, it's a whole different ecosystem basically, and the Vrilia themselves. So he meets these Vrilia, and they're basically hyper sophisticated, more advanced than us, and they have most notably wings, although they're artificial wings. They're not organic wings. I think he's a little vague.
No,
on
they're
that,
they're
actually.
definitely artificial. They work on springs, and they
Right.
said they come from a type of bird that they have.
Right. Yeah. He says they can take them off, obviously.
Yeah.
But there's other times where it really makes it sound like they're actually part of their body. It's
I
kinda
think
weird.
that's or poetic license.
Fair enough. And then, so the other thing about Bulwer-Lytton is he's got kind of a Tolkienian thing where he literally spends about the middle chunk of the book talking about their language and their cultural there's an entire chapter on how their language works, basically.
There's not a lot of actual plot here.
Yeah.
The plot is very bare bones, and it's mostly about the culture and how it compares with ours, which is basically we suck compared to them.
Yeah. Sorry, what were you saying there, Jess?
Well, that's sort of the focus on the utopian society is sort of a 19th century thing. There aren't very many utopian novels that took it to the extreme of inventing languages and detailing the languages, but going back to the original Utopia, its plots tend to be bare bone, as you say, and the interest of the reader is presumed by the writer to be about how the utopian society exists and the details of it. It's one of the reasons why you don't get good utopian novels now. It's because readers want things like character development and plots, and the expectation really wasn't there as much back in the 19th century.
Right. Yeah, I was really impressed by just how long he went on for building the world. And that's the interesting thing, because these novels, I guess, have a tendency to become, I, the author, I'm going to tell you what the perfect society would be and how great it would be if we could do things a certain way. I didn't necessarily get the impression that Bulwer-Lytton was saying this is great and good and we should all do it this way. He seems to be kind of critical of them. Am I crazy?
No.
Yeah, I think the idea is that the Vril are so far above us that they can function this way, but if we tried, we couldn't.
Right.
It's pretty much stated, I think. We're barbarians because we don't have Vril.
Vril, right. Yeah.
Which is the thing that advanced them to this point. And we'll get into hereditary stuff later. But democracy is largely looked down upon in these communities, in the Vril nations.
Right.
Being described by the derisive word kumpush, that will inevitably lead to gleknas, or universal strife and rot. Instead, they're autocratic, and but it works for them because the inheritors of power don't want to seek more power.
Right.
But that just seems to come from a natural goodness rather than the political system.
Right. Yeah. What, Jess? Sorry, you had a thought on that as well.
Well, it's a utopia and a utopian satire. He wrote it. Bulwer-Lytton wrote it in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, when the idea of the French emancipation of the poor was viewed by the ruling classes of England, and Bulwer-Lytton was one of them, as a real threat. So you've got this communist utopia, but it's really sterile and kind of unlikable. Bulwer-Lytton goes after emancipation of the poor, goes after evolution, American democracy, feminism.
Yeah.
He's sort of shotgun spraying his satire everywhere, and the result is uneven, but it's definitely satirical.
Right.
And I think he sort of operated with a split mind, in that he spends all this time talking about the utopia and praising it, but at the same time he really seems to have thought that the utopia was a bad thing. In his 1872 novel The Parisians, he talks about how great the French are because of their individualistic qualities, and how glorious Paris is, and he specifically compares the French to the Vril. And so, there's a literary criticism term called the preferred inscribed narrative, which is basically what the author's intent for the novel is. And I think his intent is to show that, yeah, they're the coming race, but they're not, what they are going to do is not good.
Right.
There's definitely a sense in the art that they create. They don't, basically.
Right, yeah.
Only older works are looked upon as worthy artistically, and because they come from a time when they still had passions, basically.
Right.
And modern art is just sort of ignored, or not even bothered with, and it's...
Yeah, we've attained the heights of that humans can attain, so there's nothing to drive us to create new art or to create new
and
new
if
ideas.
Somebody did come up with an idea to change society, nobody would want to read it because they have a perfect society.
Right, exactly. And I mean, he very openly near the beginning kind of says, you'll understand why I don't want to tell you where this all happened, because I don't want anyone to stumble across this society. And I mean, it's called The Coming Race, which is kind of ominous, basically, just right from the start.
There's an ominous idea coming through that they'll... it should be mentioned the Vril are extremely arrogant. They view everybody who doesn't have Vril as basically subhuman. There's parts, because there are underground civilizations in this book that don't have Vril, and it describes genocide, basically. Like, if these people start threatening the Vril in any way, the Vril will send a couple kids with Vril straps and just wipe them out.
Right.
Like, an entire race of people just gone because these people were inconvenienced.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about Vril. I know, and you mentioned you were mentioning, Phil, about how people like Blavatsky sort of latched on. This is another pulp idea that got latched onto by occultists around that time. It sounds like.
Yes. Blavatsky was a big believer in Vril as an actual mystical force.
Right.
She wrote about it in her books Isis Unveiled and Secret Doctrine, neither of which I've read.
Yeah.
But it was also written about in one I did read by a theosophist, William Scott Elliot, who described an alleged history of Atlantis and the story of Atlantis and Lost Lemuria, 1896, and it describes the Atlanteans having airships powered by Vril. And like I said, this was supposedly history based on psychic. I don't know.
So did she literally just read the story and go, "That must be real"?
Yeah, they. There was a common belief that Bulwer-Lytton was an adept of some sort, like initiated. There's no evidence for this, but they just assume so because he had such good knowledge about what they believed. And it's a little confusing.
Jess, he basically completely made this up, right? He did not attempt to argue that this was real, right? In his life,
right? Yeah. It was a novel that he wrote late in his life, and it made him a lot of money, and he was happy about that. The Blavatsky seizing on it was, I don't think he would have approved of that.
Yeah, well, and then, of course, you've got other worse people who...
The Nazis were interested in this to some degree, though the idea that there was a Vril Society in pre-Nazi Germany that was a secret group of the Thule Society is based on claims made in the 1960s, which historians do not believe happened. So the Vril Society that we've heard about often in conspiracy theories is probably not a real thing, but it's the Vril idea is picked up in modern Nazi occultism. There's a specific cult named Tempelhof-Gesellschaft. I don't know.
Tempelhof-Gesellschaft.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So they tie Vril into how UFOs supposedly work and the black sun symbol and all that nonsense.
Yeah. But the Nazis, but they did have some sort of occult beliefs like the Thule Society.
Yeah,
right?
it's overplayed in media though.
Okay.
Like Hitler did not get the Spear of Destiny because he thought it would actually do anything. It was just like a cool thing.
Yeah, right. Jess, our last show you were saying that you seem to be basically crediting Bulwer-Lytton with not originating the science fiction genre, but having a huge impact on making it profitable, I think you said, in that time period?
Yeah. May 1st, 1871 was the day that The Coming Race was published, was the day that George Chesney's The Battle of Dorking was published, and was the day that Samuel Butler turned in the manuscript for Erewhon into the publisher. And so May 1st, 1871, because of the overwhelming popularity of The Coming Race and of The Battle of Dorking, I've made the argument before in print that you can pretty much credit Dorking and Bulwer-Lytton with not establishing science fiction, but with popularizing it and establishing it as a marketing genre. So that, because numerically, the number of science fiction works and novels written goes up by a pretty substantial amount in the years after 1871. I think there's like 5 a year being written by 1875, whereas there was maybe one novel a year written before 1871.
Interesting. So it was, what was the Battle of Dorking? I'm not familiar with that one.
Okay. Battle of Dorking, it was written by a British major general who wanted to warn Britain that their military was underprepared for the inevitable coming European war. And so the Battle of Dorking is the story of the invasion of England and the titular Battle of Dorking, in which the British Army is undermanned and undergunned and outgeneraled and defeated. And the invaders are never specifically named, but you can tell they're meant to be German. And so this was the start of the future war genre, which was just enormously popular in the up through 1914. And even today, when you get any novel, any story that's talking about how we're about to be invaded by, like Red Dawn, for example, that's right out of the Battle of Dorking.
Huh. That's interesting. And just the fact that he had Germany going to war with, I mean, I guess, you could throw a dart at a board at Europe and assume those two countries would be fighting each other in the 19th century, but still, or up to the 19th century. But that's pretty ominous. I know I know a lot of late 19th century was kind of obsessed with, I guess, aerial bombardment and ideas of like what the future of war was going to be like. That's interesting. Anyway, but getting a little off topic though. But yeah, anyway, kind of cool. Sorry, Phil. Go ahead.
Something I was thinking about. There's an idea in the story that partially they have a peaceful society because every member has the Vril staff, which can instantly kill anybody else or
Right.
wipe out the entire civilization if they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of ties into modern ideas like mutually assured destruction.
Right.
The idea that everybody's just carrying a nuke around, basically.
Right. Yeah.
And also the NRA phrase, an armed society is a polite society, which, but it seems to take that idea as something that's actually realistic.
Yeah. Yeah. It's.
Yeah. Speaking of the Vril staffs, did either of you ever come across mention of the unauthorized sequel to The Coming Race?
No.
It's called the Vril Staff, and it's
Okay.
the author is a pseudonym, XYZ, and it's basically about what happens when this one Irishman gets a Vril staff, and he wipes out Indians, he wipes out Europeans, he wipes out Russians, basically forces world peace onto the world. And he puts up a force field that prevents the British artillery units from shelling him. He overthrows the Anglican Church. He wipes out Cossacks. Anyway, it goes on and on like that.
When was this written?
1898.
Okay.
Yeah,
I haven't heard of this at all.
Excuse me, 1891.
Okay.
It's really obscure. The only copy I ever found of it was in the British Library, but it's a really bold-faced, unashamed unauthorized sequel that the Bulwer-Lytton estate had no say in. And
Well, go ahead. Sorry.
It basically takes the premise of what if this angry Irishman found a pocket nuke and takes it as far as it'll go.
What was the author Irish? Is that why he's an Irish guy, or
Nobody knows.
or was it racism against the Irish that was causing that?
It also doesn't make sense with the original book because
Yeah, you
it's
can't
explained
use the
that
staff,
without the hereditary use,
Yeah.
which doesn't make any sense. But
Right.
basically, the Vrilya have an extra nerve in their palm, which
Right.
allows them to manipulate, and that nerve came about from constant use
Yeah.
over generations.
Yeah, he's pretty specific in the book about how he couldn't steal the Vril's technology because he can't use it, including the wings as well. And there is a moment where the daughter of the Vril lord who took him in,
Z,
she basically says, "I'll go with you." Like, she falls in love with him, and she's really devoted because the heroine some girl is always going to fall in love with the hero in these novels, even though she thinks he's an inferior life form. She's in love with him, but she literally offers to come with him above, and he's like, oh, I could use her and we could rule the world basically together. But then he's actually noble enough to say, yeah, but that's not fair to her, so I'm not going to do that. But he would need her to come along to be able to use the Vril technology, which he wouldn't be able to use on his own. And he's very specific about that. So yeah.
Speaking of racism, let's talk about race in this book.
Hang on, Jess had something to say. Sorry, go ahead.
In the Vril staff, I'd forgotten. The Irishman invents a Vril staff. He doesn't find one, he invents it. That makes it completely different.
Yeah, okay. So he doesn't have any contact with the Vrilia at all.
No, they don't even mention, the only use of the word Vril is in the novel's title, but it's pretty clear that the author's intention was to write a novel about what happens if this one guy got a Vril staff and could use it. Anyhow,
so
racism.
Sounds like everyone was kind of caught up with the idea of the Vril. I know later they had Orgon energy. That sounds like it might have been descended from the idea of the Vril.
Well, they already had things like Odic Force, which is mentioned in the story. There were a lot of pseudoscientific ideas about energy that came out of humans, and there was mesmerism and
the ether.
I think it all ties back into like early ideas of the unified field theory, and I think that's what Vril sort of is.
Mm-hmm. Well, but that would have predated anything like Einstein or anything, right?
Yeah, they were already talking about that, early versions of it, of a unified field theory. Obviously, it wasn't called that, but just it's a similar idea, and it was being thought about at the time.
Anyway, racism. You were going to say racism.
The book has some problematic issues, let's say. The Vrilia, who have brown skin, are a superior race, but to anybody on the surface world. But the use of phrenology is still a bit troubling. There's an entire long couple sentences that describe the shape of the Vrilia skulls and how they correspond to their superior emotions and attitude. Although it goes back and forth, there are different races of Vrilia. Some are described as having fair skin and blue eyes, and interracial marriages are permitted and even encouraged as making things better for everybody. So that's interesting. And like we talked about, it very much believes in the book, the scientific aspect of it, the idea of hereditary traits being or a very Lamarckian evolution rather than Darwinian evolution, I suppose, where Lamarck believed that traits that you experienced in life could be passed on to your children. So like the giraffe's neck was long because its ancestors tried to stretch their necks up, and that built up over generations.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned here, or you remind me that they talk briefly about how they believe they evolved from frogs.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. Yeah. The Vrilia have a belief that they believe has been proven scientifically that they evolved from a large kind of frog, and that's evidence of this is say they don't have sharp teeth like we do. They're just vegetarians, and
but I mean they're supposed to be basically human, right?
Yeah, it's a little confusing whether this is a parody of evolution or this is supposed to be something that actually is true in the novels world.
What do you think, Jess? Is that another satirical thing, or is that?
It's Bulwer-Lytton in sort of lumbering way using typical Victorian humor against the idea of Darwinism and evolution. Not monkeys, but frogs. Get it?
Right.
Get it?
Yeah. So he doesn't. So he was not a believer in Darwin then, or
no? He was. He was pretty traditional and conservative in his views, and he was not a fan of the implications of Darwinism.
It's interesting because it is called The Coming but again, you're saying it's a satire and it's probably parody, but it does sort of imply a superior race that can come and supplant the other one. That seems to tie into a Darwinian outlook in some ways.
Well, it's. I think it was more. I misspoke. I don't think he was exactly anti-Darwin as misunderstanding Darwin. There's a quote from another one of his novels, his last novel, Kenelm Chillingly, written in 1873, where he in the preface to the book he says the Darwinian proposition that a coming race is destined to supplant our races, that such a race would be very gradually formed and be indeed a new species developing itself of our old one, and that this process would be invisible to our eyes and therefore in some region unknown to us. He's disapproving of the implications and the end result of a sort of misunderstanding of Darwin, if that makes sense.
Okay, all right. So that's a little less grotty then in that regard. Actually, Bulwer-Lytton was kind of an interesting guy when I was researching him because, of course, he was a baronet. He was in British Columbia for a while during the gold rush. He had a whole team of Army Corps engineers that he was with. He apparently was offered the throne of Greece and turned it down. Yes. And this is mentioned, like everything I read about him just mentions this very passingly. I'm like, what? Why did he get offered the throne of Greece? Had you heard about that, Jess, at all?
Yeah, he led a pretty event-filled life. Did you read about his wife and their relationship?
Yeah. He married against his mother's wishes, I believe.
Right, and it turned out horribly.
Yeah, because they got a divorce and, well, you tell it, Jess.
Well, basically, it was a marriage of passion, and the passion faded, and then they came to loathe each other, and so she would try to show up at his speeches and interrupt what he was saying, and she wrote a novel, a really thinly veiled novel that let the world know how awful a husband he was, and just it was a nightmare relationship for both of them.
Yeah, well, didn't he try to have her committed to an insane asylum at one point
right.
too?
Yes, he did.
Yeah. It sounded like they really hated each other after a while there. Right. They were really going at it. But yeah, she wrote a novel. She wrote her biography, and it was all about how horrible he was to her and everything. Yeah.
Speaking of feminism, and I think this was mentioned earlier.
Yeah, good segue.
There are some feminist ideas in the story, whether they're supposed to be taken seriously or not. But the women of the Vril, which are called in their language jaye or singular gi, are taller and stronger than men, which are arna or singular arn. They woo in romantic relationships. So it's basically flipped from what the Victorian idea was, where the man woos the woman, and in the case of the Vril, the men are supposed to act coquettish and standoffish, and then eventually give in.
It's sort of semi-matriarchal society, even though the men still are kind of in charge, more or less. Yeah, but he talks about the women being the more aggressive race and proposing to the men and being in charge. And I didn't really get the sense that he was trying to take the piss out of feminism. I didn't feel like he was really attacking them.
It describes them. The women have to sort of acquiesce to because they want the men, so they have to sort of make promises and things. So they end up making docile wives, which is kind of, it's not really feminist, but
well, yeah, it's got a weird take. Like, it's kind of hard to nail down his take on feminism.
There's clear gender roles in this society. Women do have jobs and things. Like the Z is the from the Council of Sages or whatever,
right?
Or the College of Sages. But there are clear gender roles. Say, female Vril staffs are designed for different purposes. They heal instead of destroy generally, or the destructive properties are downplayed rather.
Right.
So it definitely has the idea that women and men are fundamentally different, but it has different ideas on how society itself should be organized around that principle.
Any thoughts, Jess, about like what that relates to?
Well, I think he's trying to have it both ways. He's satirizing them when they're feminists, when they're acting like Victorian feminists, but then he also goes on to show them as after marriage being the ideal Victorian wives. So, he's having his cake and eating it too.
So what do you think he would be somewhat sympathetic to, or whatever they would say, women's suffrage or whatever feminists were called at the 1870? I'm not sure what the term would have been.
I think he would have been, I'm not sure he would have wanted women to vote, but he would have been sympathetic to getting better working conditions for them, that sort of thing. Certainly his society novels and even some of his occult fantasies show some real sympathy for the female characters.
Yeah.
But at the same time, high society women gave him no end of grief because of his marriage. And
Right.
so he probably would have been more sympathetic to working class women than to upper class feminists.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't come off as, them ladies, but even if he's satiring, it doesn't. If he's being satirical, it doesn't really come off as contemptuous. It's just there's some weird ideas in there that are hard to parse, basically.
Oh, something I thought of that was interesting. There's a later Lovecraft story called The Mound. Which is basically Lovecraft's idea of this story. There's no evidence that he talked about it that way, but it's basically the same thing. It's about a guy who discovers an underground civilization under Oklahoma. They're aliens, but they're related to Native Americans. They interbred with Native Americans. It's not as racist as Lovecraft as you would expect from Lovecraft. It's still racist, but not as racist as you would expect. But they're an advanced race and all that, and the woman falls in love with him, and so it's basically the same story, but a lot more horror based. Anyway, I thought that would be interesting.
Given Lovecraft, I'm surprised that's not an excuse for a lot of.
Yeah, it was co-written by somebody else, so I don't know how much that was the other author, but apparently the other author just basically said, gave a rough outline, and Lovecraft made up this whole underground civilization thing that was sort of his idea. I actually like that story a lot. It's one of my favorite Lovecraft stories, even though it's pretty obscure. It does tie into the Cthulhu thing because they worship Cthulhu. So that's something you can read if you're interested, anybody who's listening to this.
Yeah. Anyway, but yeah.
Oh, and also one last thing. There's no movie adaptations of this book, but there is an upcoming movie called Iron Sky: The Coming Race. It seems to use not just if you haven't heard of Coming Race or Iron Sky, it's a sort of pulpy, slightly satirical movie about Nazis on the moon who come back to Earth and try to invade. I thought at the time that the satire was a little bit broad, but the recent events have maybe, I don't know, maybe it was pretty on the nose. Like a presidential candidate using Nazi propaganda, thinly disguised. So, I'd have to revisit it because I haven't seen it since it came out. And the new movie isn't getting very good reviews, which is too bad, but I'm still looking forward to it. It seems to use some aspects of the novel, like the Hollow Earth theory is a major plot point, apparently, and the logo of the film includes the supposed Vril Society symbol from Nazi Germany, which once again did not exist, but
as you say, it's become a pop culture idea. Any final thoughts there, Jess?
Well, just that it is it's a lot better written than most of The Coming Race is a lot better written than most of Bulwer-Lytton's work, and I think if you're interested in 19th century science fiction or in Bulwer-Lytton or in Hollow Earth fiction, you could do a lot worse than starting with it. It's not a flawless novel by any means, but it's better than one might expect.
Yeah, it's not long. It's a quick read.
Yeah, it's quite short.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Well, that's it for us today at What Mad Universe. We've been Philip, Adam, and Jess Nevins of the Council of Sages. Anything you want to plug, Jess?
I am going to be, in September, I'm going to be doing a Kickstarter for a role-playing game called Explorers of the Fantastic, which will be out next spring. The tagline or the elevator pitch for the game is Challengers of the Unknown Fight Godzilla.
Oh, cool.
All right.
Our producer and tour was Alex Ross, and our theme song was done by Jack Feerick, a very well-bred songbird trained by the Vril. Yeah, that was a thing in the novel we didn't really mention. Anyway.
Nobody's going to get these references.
Before we take leave of you, I will impart with the final words of the novel. I have thought it my duty to my fellow men to place on record these forewarnings of the coming race.